Tēnā koutou katoa, a very good afternoon and good morning to all of you. And yeah, and we'll just to let the ones that just join, the webinar will be recorded today and then will be made available on our website in the near future. So before we launch into the sort of more detailed stuff, I will just say a karakia to set the scene for today, a short one. Mori oho, mori tu, mori ora, ki a tatou, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. So loosely translated, that means life force awaken, life force stand tall, life force all wellness, good health for all. Join together, unite. The group is ready to progress for the purpose of coming together. I thought that was quite a suitable one for what we're going to be listening and discussing about today. So welcome again. I am Haujin. I'm one of the coordinators of the Conservation Coaches Network Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand. And we have a committee that meets every other month. And in between the meetings, we try and run the webinars on different topics centered around the conservation standards and or adaptive management, and to support practitioners on their journey in the space. So welcome again to the webinar titled An Outcomes-Based Approach for Assessing the Effectiveness of Protected and Conserved Areas. And we have here today Nick Slavsky from the Foundations of Success. So Nick, hopefully your audio is working. Just now when we tested the tech, his video worked fine, but in between, just now and now, something happened. So hopefully the audio still works fine. And I'm just gonna give a quick introduction to our speaker today. Nick is from, as I said, the Foundations of Success, and we're very fortunate to be able to have him today, especially because he lives in a different time zone, to speak on his very fantastic work that he and his colleague has been working on in the last couple of years or so, and probably very glad that this has culminated in a paper that has been published recently. So Nick, if you're ready, I can hand over the mic to you, figuratively speaking, to introduce yourself and your work. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. And apologies for the lack of video. Somehow Teams doesn't like it, as Haujin said, since we tested it earlier. So you'll hear my voice and you'll see the slides, which is probably the most important thing anyway. Nice to see a lot of familiar faces. Nice to see some new faces as well. So glad to be able to share what we've been up to. So what I have is a presentation that I'll run through. If I go straight through it, probably 25, 30 minutes. I'll pause once in a while, see if there's any clarifications, and then hopefully there's time for discussion afterwards as well. So let me start with going into slideshow mode. Okay, so this is an outcomes-based approach for assessing the effectiveness of protected and conserved areas. And just a little bit of us, Foundations of Success, or FOS. Many of you know who we are. Where I started off as a not-for-profit organization in the United States. Our mission is to amplify the collective impact of the global conservation community. We now have members in North America, Latin America, Europe, and Southern Africa. We also do a lot of work with folks in Australia and New Zealand as well. We provide training and coaching, we develop frameworks and tools, we facilitate collaborative learning, and we build capacity for the future. Our sort of unofficial tagline, if you will, is that we don't actually implement conservation work, but we try to make other people's work better. This is also, more importantly, a different hat that I've been wearing, along with my colleague Paula Mejia, where 4 years ago, Madhu Rao, who is the chair of the World Commission on Protected Areas, or WCPA, she came to Paula and myself and said, hey, I really think we need to think about outcomes a little bit more in terms of how we assess the effectiveness of protected areas. And so she asked us to convene and chair a task force that spent 4 years looking at this question. And a lot of what we're presenting is not just the two of us, but it's actually the work of this entire task force that we're going to be presenting. And then, of course, I also wear a hat, like many of you, with the Conservation Measures Partnership, or CMP. And as you know, CMP produces the conservation standards, which started off in 2004 and has gone through numerous iterations, culminating in this version in 2025, version 5. And the conservation standards are sort of best practices for managing conservation projects and programs more generally. But if we think about protected and conserved areas, they're really just a form of conservation project. And so what I think is really interesting about this work, and part of the unofficial work that Paolo and I have been doing, we don't tell this to everybody, but to this group, I feel comfortable sharing it, that there's been a whole world of people who are climbing the mountain of effectiveness, who come from WCPA and the traditions of the parks and protected area community. And then there's a whole nother world of folks in the Conservation Measures Partnership and CCNet who have been working and climbing that same mountain. And interestingly, there's been a few protected area systems, most notably the Red Parkus groups in Latin America, who Paolo works with, who are already at the top of that mountain and have already learned a lot about how to do this stuff. But as you'll see, unofficially, what we've been really trying to do is bring these two worlds together and kind of merge some of the thinking or harvest the thinking from both of these worlds. And at the end of this talk, I'm going to come back to how I think CCNet and CMP can kind of engage with this work and really help out drive this forward if you think it's useful. Okay, so the theory of change for our task force. So, being good conservation standard practitioners, we had to have a theory of change. So our theory of change was that we wanted to start with existing effectiveness frameworks and tools and collect and analyze them. So we developed a Rosetta Stone that I'll talk a little bit more about. We then wanted to develop a generic approach, principles and framework of criteria and indicators to how to think about effectiveness of protecting conserved areas. We piloted and tested that with a bunch of different systems. Based on that, we hope that managers will be able to use the generic approach to improve their systems. Data from frameworks and tools will easily be incorporated into standard assessments. And why are we going to all this trouble? Well, it's because we want protected and conserved areas to have public, credible, current, and useful outcome-based effectiveness assessments. If we can do that, then PCA managers will use the assessments to identify gaps needed and to improve their practices. And then based on that, they'll be able to get the funding and support they need to actually fill those gaps. In addition to that, that would lead to PCAs achieving their desired outcomes. But we also want to have these effectiveness assessments in place so that 30 by 30 commitments can be easily tracked, and broader society has confidence in PCAs and provides sufficient support. So for us, it's really about two tracks that you'll see as themes in this presentation. How can we improve management, and how can we have credible reporting? And both of those are really important to what we really want to get done here. Okay, so starting with this first step of the Rosetta Stone, this all comes back to this global effort, this ambitious global effort to get 30% of the world's waters and lands in areas that are effectively conserved and managed. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the 30 by 30 goal. And the key thing here is this phrase, effectively conserved and managed. What does that actually mean? And how can we use this to actually improve management? So our first step was to come up with a Rosetta Stone analysis. And as you might imagine, there are a ton of frameworks and tools that are out there. So what I mean by framework would be something like the original PAME framework that Mark Hawkins and a bunch of other people developed in the early 2000s. And so you can see that framework about how to think about effectiveness was developed. And then a tool might be the MET, the Managed Effectiveness Tracking Tool, which was a tool that was implemented to help implement that particular framework. A similar framework that kind of came a bit later was the IUCN Green List standard. Version 1.1 came out in 2017. Actually, version 2 that incorporates a lot of these principles has just been released. And then, for example, a tool is we're working with the IUCN Secretariat and the Green List to develop a self-assessment tool that people can use to see how are you doing vis-a-vis the Green List standard. Of course, countries have their own management guides and their own effectiveness tools and frameworks that they use. So there's a lot of stuff from countries. And then, as I said, in some ways, you can think about the conservation standards as both a framework, and then all the affiliated tools that come with the standards, like Merati or other things, are tools that actually help implement that particular framework. So there's a lot of thinking that's been done on this topic. What we did in our Rosetta Stone is we took all that individual thinking and said, well, how do they chunk up the world? What do they actually think about when they think about effectiveness? What are their components? What are their results? And we looked at them in their original order. But then what we did is we crosswalked them. We took all those frameworks and tools and said, Where are they similar? Where are they have differences? Where are there gaps? So we wanted to learn from what the world had done. What that enabled us to do is then develop a generic effectiveness approach that includes principles as well as a framework with criteria and indicators. So I want to share with you a couple of the high-level principles that emerge from this work. So one of them is that when we think about effectiveness, we need to think both about an individual area and at a network level. So for us, an individual area might be a group of people, a team that is charged with managing that specific site, that area. They are going to pick the values that they care about. The natural values might be things like jaguars or forest ecosystems, what the conservation standards used to call targets and is now called values in a nod to be congruent with this community. And of course, that team is implementing one or more strategies to promote the conservation of those values. Of course, they're not just necessarily natural values. They could also be human well-being values or cultural values as well. So we're trying to think about one area. That area is often part of a broader network of areas, and that network is part of a protected area system. And that system can have higher level values that it's trying to accomplish and higher level strategies that it's undertaking as well. And you'll note that I'm using the acronym Protected and Conserved Area, or PCA. I'm actually deliberately using that. That's a new proposal coming out of WCPA to talk about both protected areas, the traditional protected areas that we're familiar with, as well as other forms of area-based management, most notably other effective area-based management systems, OECMs, measures, OECMs. And we think that what we're doing here, as you'll see, actually applies not just to protected areas, but also to OECMs and other forms of area-based management. And that's part of what we're testing and looking at going forward. Okay, a second principle is that if we want to think about effectiveness, we have to think about both process and outcomes. And the analogy that I like to use here is imagine that there's two teams that are rowing and rowers face backwards. And over some interval, they need to achieve a conservation outcome. So after a while, after that interval, Team A has crossed the finish line and they've achieved the conservation outcome. And Team B is way back here rowing madly. And I'm going to ask you the question, which team has been effective? And so obviously, Team A, because they've achieved the outcome, should get the green check mark and the accolades and all that kind of good stuff. And Team B, well, they get the red X because they didn't achieve their outcome. But of course, you know it's a trick question. And here's the trick. If I gave you a little bit of additional information and said that Team A had a current of enabling conditions, so they just sat there and they basically drifted across the finish line, and Team B is rowing like mad in the face of huge threats, and without all their work, they would be another 3 kilometers further to the left. And then I asked you which team has been more effective. Well, it's a kind of a different story. And what it teaches us is that we have to think about ultimate outcomes, but we also have to think about intermediate results, and we have to think about the process that you're doing to get there. And so we need to think about both of those in terms of effectiveness. A third principle is that if you want to talk about effectiveness, and this even goes back to the dictionary definition of effectiveness, you have to state what you're trying to accomplish. In other words, you have to set the bar for what you're trying to accomplish over that interval. And so that bar represents what you need to do. It needs to be specified by the team, the managers during the planning process. And it represents what they want to ultimately accomplish or help get en route to getting to where they want to accomplish. What we've learned is you can't set the bar artificially low and then just hop over and say, woohoo, we managed to make this work. So it has to be credible. But strangely enough, you also can't set the bar too high. And where this comes into play is in things like climate change. You can't sort of say for our protected area, we are going to stop all the impacts of climate change, because that's just not realistic. And so if you set the bar too high, you're setting yourself up for failure, and it's not really meaningful. So what we've learned is that we actually have to set the bar at a place that is results oriented. It's high enough to matter, but also achievable, low enough to be feasible. And then that bar has to be specific, measurable, and time limited. So basically, it has to be a smart objective or outcome. And for all of you conservation standards folks and coaches, this is actually why in the conservation standards we put such emphasis on SMART goals and objectives, because they really represent the bar against which we're going to measure our progress over time. But the metaphor is slightly wrong. It's actually not one bar. It's actually a set of hurdles that you have to go across that lead from your management processes through to your outcomes. And I'll come back to more in that in just a second. A fifth principle is that a good effectiveness approach balances feasibility, usefulness, and credibility. So when we talk about who are doing the assessments, they can be done by first party, where the managers themselves certify that what we're doing is fine. They could be second party, where you have a peer review of what's going on, or they could be a full-on third independent party assessments as well. And what's really interesting about this is in the service sector or in the computer software writing, code writing sector, there's something called the iron triangle. And what the iron triangle says is that if you want a piece of software or furniture, you can get it good and fast, but then it's going to be expensive. You can get it good and cheap, but then it's going to be slow to produce, or you can get it cheap and fast, but then it's going to be low quality. And the iron triangle says that it's really impossible to have all three of those things at once. And so the interesting thing in the effectiveness world is we want our assessments to be useful, we want them to be feasible, and we want them to be credible. But the question is that really possible to do all three of those? So if you do a third-party theory of change full-on assessment, it's useful and credible, but can we do that for hundreds of thousands of protected areas around the world? If we want a non-theory of change check mark or just a checkbox exercise, yeah, it's feasible. Maybe it's credible. It's not that useful for managers in terms of improving things. And if we do a first-party theory of change-based approach, it might be feasible and useful, but it loses that credibility. And so one of the things that we're looking at is that middle ground actually blank, or can we do interesting things with second-party theory of change-based assessments? But what I want to really leave you with, and I think this is the most important message that you're going to get today, is that if we want this kind of end of the theory of change to happen, if we want managers to do improved management and we want credible reporting, then, and we want it feasible to apply globally, useful to managers and credible supporters, then the framework and we use for assessing effectiveness has to be the same framework that we're using to manage the protected area. So that therefore you can actually take your management results and then spin them into your assessment. And if your assessment identifies gaps, you can put them back into your management system and figure out how to mix them. And what's been really interesting, if you look at that metaphor of the mountain, is that the systems and frameworks that a lot of protected area systems use to manage their parks are different than the MET or these other tools that they're using to assess them. And what we really want to see is, can we bring those two worlds together? So with that, I'm going to share with you now the generic framework linking management and outcomes that we developed, or I should say we actually adapted from folks in Peru and other people who had actually done earlier versions of this work. But basically, what we've come together and said that if you want to have an effective protected and conserved area, you have to have good governance in place. You have to understand it has to be well designed, and it has to fit, and you have to understand the context in which that protected area operates. You have to do good planning and management. So there's a planning element to this as well, and then ongoing strategy implementation with iteration back and forth. You then have to think about your outcomes, which include, of course, threats being mitigated. In this day and age, we're actually adding very explicitly that restoration needs have to be met as well. That leads to your natural and cultural values being conserved. That leads to human well-being being enhanced. And of course, there's a monitoring adaptation, a shorter term loop that has to happen, as well as a longer term kind of looking at the design and the longer term, bigger picture things. And based on all that, you can then use that for national and global reporting. So at the highest level, we think this is the theory of change or the framework of how to think about protected area management at a site level. This model then extends to a system level. So you can add a PCA system. And at the system level, you have to do something similar. You have to think about governance, design and context, planning and management. But in this case, then you do that work up there. It actually leads to the planning, design, and implementation of individual sites. And then the outcomes of those sites roll up to the outcomes of the overall PCA system. But there's a lot of debate and discussion of whether strategies and whether things happen also at that system level to complement what's happening at the site level as well. So this is kind of the full framework that our task force developed of how to think about PCAs and PCA systems. When we reviewed all the existing frameworks and tools against this thing here, what we found is that a lot of the existing frameworks and tools are pretty good about governance. They have some things about planning and management and all that kind of stuff, that they were maybe not so good at thinking about strategy implementation. There was some real mixed approaches to how they think about strategies. And they gave lip service to outcomes, but there were major gaps in practically and usefully tracking outcomes. And they even didn't really touch the idea of how you do monitoring and adaptation. So there were some real holes or some real gaps, again, in the MET, the green list, a lot of these tools that are trying to do this kind of thinking. And we said, well, where could we go, or who knows about how to do these kinds of things? And so we were able to sort of come up with our full framework that really kind of has a whole bunch of different elements here for thinking about each of these boxes down here. So at the highest level, these are our components. Then you have our criteria, which are the 1.1, 1.2, and then you have your elements underneath that, which are the more specific things that we think have to happen. As the colors show you, they fall into different bins. So there's a bunch of enabling conditions. There's a bunch of adaptive management process steps. There are some intermediate results and some ultimate outcomes. And as I showed you before, it was particularly the outcomes and the strategy implementation that this world was pretty weak. And so if you look at the elements, what we've actually done is borrowed a lot from the conservation standards and other ways of thinking about these kinds of things. So for example, if we want to track strategy implementation, if you look at the MET or if you look at the green list, they ask a couple questions about, are you able to enforce laws and regulations? But it's kind of a random list of questions. And so what we were able to do is sort of say, well, we know what a generic theory of change for enforcing laws and regulations might look like. So at a very high level, it's sort of a 6-box results chain here. You have to have your enabling conditions in place. You have to have enough sufficient capacity. You have to have appropriate enforcement actions fairly implemented in the right place at the right time. As a result of that, a sufficient percent of offenders are encountered, apprehended, and sanctioned. That enforcement deters additional offenders, and that leads to illegal taking or use of PCA resources managed or mitigated. And so that's a pretty classic, comes actually from the CAML, the Conservation Actions and Measures Library. It's a pretty standard conservation standards theory of change of what that enforcing laws and regulations action might look like. What we think we can do, hopefully, is we can encourage people who are evaluating their protected or conserved area for effectiveness to look at that theory of change and ask a bunch of key adaptive management questions. Have you done strategy planning? Do you have sufficient capacity? Did you implement your activities as planned? Are you seeing the results you expected to see? And are these results sufficiently reducing or managing the threat or restoring the value? And so we've created a table here where we're encouraging protected area managers to put some of their key strategies, to talk about the generic strategy of this type. In this case, it's enforcing laws and regulations, but we have similar generic chains for direct management or for outreach and awareness raising or for education. So for the common strategies that protected areas use, we can actually then come in and come up with those generic strategies, and we can ask the users to answer these simple questions about those strategies as a guide to sort of saying, are we understanding whether they know how to think about strategies appropriately, or are there gaps that they might want to identify? So that's an example of how we're trying to improve effectiveness assessments, thinking about strategies. We're also trying to do this for outcomes. So for example, for threats, what we're coaching people to do is to list their threats or their climate impacts. We also think we might need to do it for restoration needs as well. So not just your threats, but also your restoration needs. And we're asking people to rate what is your base, because remember, assessments always have to take place over an interval. So we're asking people to say, what was your baseline threat rating? Can you set the bar? What was your bar, at least qualitatively? So was your bar for that interval to eliminate the threat, to reduce the baseline threat level, to basically restore the value, or to mitigate threat impacts? So you can qualitatively, directionally talk about what your objective was. And then at the end of the assessment period, you can say, where is our status? And did we achieve that objective? And is it on track? Is it partially some issues? No major issues? And if there's major issues, we're going to put a little warning light out there. We can talk about the source of the assessment. And then most importantly, we want to encourage people where they have deficiencies to think about what would their management response need to be. So we can do threats qualitatively. But we can also allow more quantitative objectives and indicators if people have them. So people could put on a full-on smart threat or need objective, put their indicators, and actually put their baseline measurements. So again, we're supporting both qualitative and or quantitative ways of thinking about the threats that they're dealing with within a protected area. Similarly, we're going to do the same thing for values. So for people's natural values, but also their cultural values, we're going to ask them to come up with indicators, thresholds, come up with their status, set a directional goal, or if they want, they can set, I don't show it here because I don't have space, but we can also, in a similar way to threats, show a SMART goal, a SMART of what they're trying to accomplish. And then we ask, did you achieve that goal? What's the source of the assessment? And again, if you didn't achieve the goal, what are you going to do differently about it? What's your management response? So for all three of these, for the strategies, for the threats, and for the values, I don't think it's going to look very surprising or very different to anyone who understands the conservation standards. But what we're trying to do is bring that way of thinking into the assessments of protected and conserved areas. So again, you can see this based on this viability methodology. It allows for interpreting goals, encourages management responses. And then we can also do a roll-up. Are all your goals achieved or on track? Are all goals achieved on track, but some concerns about the trend? One or more goals with some issues, one or goal with major issues. So it's not that different at a roll-up level of what you might find in a traditional MET or green list, but there's a little bit more underlying thinking here that would support those conclusions. So once we came up with that generic framework, we piloted, tested it with a bunch of different systems. So we did desk reviews with a whole bunch of folks in Latin America and with Bush Heritage folks in Australia. Claire, you might have been part of that, working with folks in Canada, working with folks in Croatia. And then we also took it to South Africa, to Tanzania, to different parts of the world. So we're sort of testing this framework in the field to see whether it was doable and feasible and whether it actually made sense. So we piloted, tested it with a whole bunch of different systems. What we're now trying to do is incorporate this approach into existing tools. So one of our things is that we don't think the world needs another effectiveness framework, that God knows there's enough of them out there already. But what we're instead doing is working to take these principles and this generic framework and bake it into the work that people are doing. So we're working with national agencies to improve their frameworks and tools. So we think that it's highly unlikely that all countries will use the same exact assessment system, but we can ensure that each of their systems is aligned with this global reporting system and builds on the frameworks and tools already in use. So we can actually improve these tools. We're also using it to help people build gauges and dashboards that track what's going on. And so we really want to kind of help people build tools that would use and make sense of the work. So an analogy I often use here is what makes that dashboard gauge useful. I would submit to you it's three things: that there's an information need. When do I need to pull over and get fuel? That there's an actual measurement that measures how much liquid's in my tank. And then that measurement, that indicator is important, but it's useless without the interpretive markings underneath that actually tell you how to read the gauge and trigger your action. And as we get smarter over time in the dashboard world, we can move from doing analog kinds of things to actually giving people the information that they need to know. But what we want to avoid are building things like this, which look cool and look good on a dashboard, but no one actually uses them to make any decisions unless they're race car drivers. And so they're a waste of cognitive space and time. And so we want to avoid these tachometers. So what we're trying to do is actually figure out how can we take that effectiveness information and summarize it and create dashboards that would allow managers to sort of see, where is it that I have a problem? I want to look to see where I have an exclamation point. Did I improve from the baseline to the current? And then what is the status change over that interval? And then as part of your dashboard, you would also then see, how am I doing on my strategies? How am I doing on my threats and my values? And we think that this is the kind of dashboard that protected area managers need, not just to show their effectiveness, but then to cue that adaptive management cycle that gets them going full cycle and gets them into the work they need to do. We're also working with the WCPA Green List standards to make recommendations for the next list of the Green Standard, which actually just came out. We're working with the IUCN Secretariat to improve the Green List self-assessment tool. And we're just wrapping up an effort with the GF to improve the use of MET for protected areas and OECMs. And so we've gone through a whole long exercise to see how much of this actually applies not just to traditional protected areas, but also OECMs as well. I can get more into detail about that if people are curious. But part of what we're learning to do in the self-assessment tool is ask questions in a more useful and helpful way. So for example, in this green list self-assessment tool, we're going to ask a question: does your protected area have an appropriate legal framework whose elements include a clearly defined purpose, appropriate legal status, clearly defined legal boundaries, and appropriate governance authority? You could, at a high level, if you want, answer yes, it has all these elements, or no, not yet. But it might be actually easier to take those dimensions and break them into smaller purposes, a more detailed way of answering each individual question. And then one of the things that we've really tried to do here is avoid yes, no answers, but have yes, no with nuance. And so what we want to actually ask people in our questions and our answers is, does your protector have an appropriate legal status that enables it to meet its purpose? Yes, it has an appropriate legal status. Yes, it has a legal status, but there's some minor issues to be resolved. No, it has a legal status, but not the right one for the stated purpose. No, not yet, but the process has begun. No, not yet, this is an issue at the site level, or no, not yet, this is the issue at the system level. And the reason it's really important to bring in this nuance is your response would be very different if there's an issue at the site level or at the system level, or the process has begun, but we just haven't gotten there yet. And what we can then also do with these kinds of tools is give people guidance to help them fix identified problems. So if someone says, no, we haven't set our legal status because there's an issue at the site level, we want to pop up a button and send people to coaches or to people who can actually fix the identified problem. We're not interested in punishing people. We want people to get better at what they're doing. One of the last things we're doing here is we're also thinking about using this framework to develop translation algorithms across tools, so that if people have filled out the MET or the green list or their own country thing, that we can actually translate those answers, bring them into the protected area PAME database, and have then maybe going forward better information that we can use and share with one another. So again, in summary, we want a system that balances feasible usefulness and credibility. We want it feasible to apply globally. It has to be useful to managers and has to be credible to supporters. And that's really kind of what we're aiming for across all these different tools and approaches. I started off this whole presentation by saying that we're trying to bring together these two worlds. So there is the WCPA World Commission on Protected Areas. Our task force has come to an end, but there is a new WCPA specialist group that Paula is co-chairing that is sort of taking on the mantle of this work and trying to bring together not just effectiveness assessments, but also ongoing management. There is, of course, the whole world of the CMP and the CCNet. And in my last slide, what I'd like to talk and challenge you all to help us with is, what can CCMP and CCNet do to help realize this dream of climbing this mountain? And so a few things that come to my mind is, one is we'd love to get you to review and provide feedback to framework and tool development. We would love to maybe provide coaching and training to PCA managers using these tools. So there's going to be, if we're able to succeed at what we're trying to do, there's going to be a lot of protected areas around the world who are going to need to do how to use generic theories of change, or how to have to do a threats assessment, who are going to do viability analysis. And we would love to figure out how to link up coaches and trainers to that whole world. There's going to be a huge amount of work developing guidance and examples of applying this framework in different contexts. We want to think about what can we do better to link ongoing PCA management to PCA effectiveness assessments that I've talked about. And then we also probably need your help to advocate for use of these improved frameworks and tools in the PA systems. There's a lot of people who say, hey, we've used the MET, it's good enough. Why should we do anything differently? So let's just keep using the MET. And those people, we need to have voices that say, yeah, you could do the MET, but we could do the MET plus, or we can do the MET better by kind of involving some of these different principles and ideas in this work. And then, of course, you all may have other ideas or things that you want to do as well. And I'd love to hear about them. So in summary, that's the issue paper that Howden talked about that you could read and download. You can certainly reach me or Paula, and we have a little bit of time to discuss any questions or ideas that you might have as well. So hopefully that's the right time and leaves us enough time for discussion. And I'm sorry I can't be on video. I would normally come on video so you could see me and I could see you, but at least hopefully we can talk.
Oh wow, kia ora, Nick. That is really, really exciting and awesome. You know, coming from a point of view personally as somebody who's worked in all three kind of spaces before, you know, myself being involved in protected area management effectiveness in my sort of past life, and also in eventually sort of getting into working with IUCN protected area of green list of protected area and conserved areas. Yeah, this is really exciting to see that, the kind of, couple of worlds have aligned. Yeah, and so I guess, this is now a open session for any questions or even comments, or if I know that Nick has set out some sort of ask at the end, if people are just happy to maybe respond to that at the top of just kind of top lined, or you want to go back and think about it and get in touch with Nick, that's great. Um, so yeah, open to the floor now for questions.
So someone asked if I could share the slides. I'll just put the link in the deck into the chat right now.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Beth. And I'll probably just copy and paste the link for the paper in the chat too, so that people don't have to look for that too much. And we'll put the resources up on the website as well. Claire.
Thanks. Hi, Nick. That was awesome. Thank you so much. I mean, I guess this is just a general kind of vibe check about the whole process, how incredible, but how difficult did you find the enthusiasm of all the different people and organisations and groups that you worked across globally? Was there a real kind of, is there momentum to really take all this incredible work that you've done and really kind of, rally the troops and let's get some stuff done? How did you kind of feel that?
Change is hard, I mean, and changing systems is hard and difficult. And I think people have training and translations and work and previous work invested in existing systems. And I think that often people want to hold on to those existing systems because of that. But I also think people understand the need and why we need to have a more outcome-focused approach. And I think they understand the need to sort of link our actions to our outcomes and to be able to help protect areas understand that. And so I think there are people who want to be advocates for one system or another for whatever reason, and they can be a bit resistant. But I think that working with folks, and as I said, it wasn't just Paula and me. We had a team of a lot of people and a lot of experts helping us think this through, and we tested this in a whole bunch of different places. And I think people see the value of it. And it's the same thing. It's, as you all know, when I started working on the conservation standards, a couple decades ago, I didn't think it was going to take 20 years to get the world to adopt the conservation standards. I thought it was a pretty obvious thing to do. But change is hard and change processes are hard. And I think we're facing some of those same things. But I also see this as, by bringing these two worlds together, as an impetus to sort of overcome some of that resistance and really get people doing things.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
If it's okay, I'll go ahead and ask a question since I have my hand raised. Nick, I found this so pragmatic as an approach. I work for Department of Conservation in New Zealand, and our work is very outcomes focused, and or most of the time it's meant to be outcomes focused, and we tend to work with community groups to get them there. But with the language, what you've laid out, it just seemed very pragmatic and making it very simple and clear and easy, which can often be the most difficult part. So just really appreciate that. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that. And I will say that I think, if people say, what is one of the secrets to hopefully achieving some of what you've mentioned, it's because we've begged, borrowed, and stolen from 25 years of the conservation standards experience in doing this, right? I mean, that's why I think it's crazy that these two worlds haven't come together, because I do think that the conservation standards world knows a lot and has learned a lot about how to make this stuff accessible to practitioners. And one of the pushbacks we get is, well, people say, well, you can't apply this to Indigenous-led or community groups, or you can't do this. And I say, well, excuse me, healthy country planning, excuse me, LMMAs. I mean, we have a long history of doing this with Indigenous groups, and I don't accept anymore that people, those kinds of groups can't do this kind of thinking, because we've shown it. You all have shown it.
Thanks, Beth. And I would also like to add that, this I really do agree with you, Nick, in terms of the work that you and your task force have done to add value to the kind of management effectiveness framework assessments, basically. Because when I was working in the space, when we were using the MET tool, what struck us most was, you could carry out that assessment, but it was pretty qualitative, and the answers that you were you provided was sort of categorized into 4 categories, basically, and it doesn't really help you move forward in terms of, oh yeah, well, we didn't meet this, but how do we move forward? So this was really great that this piece of work actually help refine that, and then actually help add value to help protect area managers move forward in that space, because they are very hands-on people. I work with them, I know that. And they just want to get on and get things done. So yeah, so just kudos to you and the workforce doing this. Yeah, so over to you, Leah.
Thanks, Haojin, and thanks, Nick. Yeah, it's a really amazing piece of work. Yeah, it's really great to see it out there. I'm wondering how can we start using it? Or, we work with a lot of groups. Like, can we start trialing it with people? Are those spreadsheets available? Or is that a conversation you and I have offline? What's the next steps?
We're trying to make it. So the tricky thing is, and I think this is, again, goes back to what I was saying about, and some of the comments that were just a few minutes ago. One way we're trying to sell this is by saying we are not creating a new framework, or a new tool. We're not creating new tools, right? But what we're trying to do is improve existing tools, and so one thing, I'm happy, in fact, if you go to that link that has the paper has a link to the Google's tables that have all that information. So I mean, the framework is available. It's there. How we convert that into usable tools, or how we combine it things, is an interesting question. So what I would ask in your case, Leah, is what tools are the people you're working with already using, and how can we kind of merge these in or bring them into the tools that they're using? Or would it make sense to, it hasn't become made public yet, but the IUCN, the green list self-assessment tool, I think that's going to be a really good example. And I'm hoping that we can get IUCN to then put that in the public domain so other people could translate into other languages or tweak it as they need to tweak it. That we're trying to do things more in a Creative Commons approach, that people can then take that stuff and use it. So I'd be happy to have conversations, Leah, of what we can do to support testing and running it and working with your folks. But also, I think there's lots of ways in which you could do it on your own as well.
Okay. Yeah, great. I suspect, working a lot in Indigenous protected area space, there are probably not many tools being used at all. So anything like this will be very helpful for a lot of groups. Yeah.
I mean, it might be really interesting to think about, a healthy country planning version of this, right? I mean, there's because and using the skills that you all have developing those kinds of tools and translate in a way that is approachable by those kinds of groups, it would be a really fascinating kind of follow-on exercise. Because I will tell you, especially as we're doing this OECM work, we're getting a lot of pushback. Again, what I was saying before, where the Jeff people or the OECM people are saying, well, OECMs are run by Indigenous people, so we can't ask them to fill out a form like this. And I'm like, well, I'd beg to differ. But how could we do it in a way that's appropriate and that helps them and supports them what they're trying to do? So maybe, Leah, I'll follow up with you, because I mean that would be a really interesting kind of follow-on work, is to even think about how we could create a version or a tool that's based on this framework that would fit within the context that you're talking about. And I think that would go a long way towards quieting some of that criticism.
Yeah, great. Yep, I look forward to it.
Yeah, and anybody who would like to also trial that, yeah, I think Nick has already opened the invitation to working with those. Yeah, who would like to trial this, especially in the Indigenous space or ECM space. Reach out to Nick. Nick, I have a question around, you know, obviously you've worked with a range of people in this, and I did wonder if you had, you know, work with people who work in a UNESCO space, because they have the World Heritage Sites sort of certification, and then you know, with the biosphere as well. So yeah, just wondering if you've done that, and if not, if you were planning to sort of reach out to them.
Not so much directly with UNESCO and the World Heritage stuff. I think there is a lot of potential overlap, and that would be an interesting thing to add. We have been talking, for example, to the FAO people in the context of the OECMs that they're managing and working on. So a lot of the different, and then we're working with the Jeff and the World Bank. So a lot of these multilateral or UN agencies, I think there is a lot of potential overlap. We haven't in particular with World Heritage, but I would be open to it, and it would be fun to figure out how to make that happen.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick, for that. Any questions from anybody else? For this remaining 10 minutes? Any kind of ideas or thoughts that you want to share with the group as well?
Claire, could I ask you? Claire, you were involved. Did you work with Annette when Annette tested this? Did she do that with you, or?
Yeah, we did. I did, and it was last year, and I can barely remember what happened on the weekend. So I'm just trying to go back to.
I was just asking if you could share your experience. You can share your experience there.
I do remember. Yes. I think we tested it on a couple of our reserves up in Queensland. And that was with you, and was there a couple of other people?
I think Paolo was involved in that.
Yeah.
It's all a dream. It's all a distant dream.
Well, no, I think it's, well, you know, it's not undermining what we did last year. It's just the fact that clearly my memory's a little bit shot. But look, I think this, I mean, I'm with you, and I'm probably with everyone that's on this call, that I think the conservation standards is amazing, and I can't understand why people isn't using it. It's a framework. You just plug in whatever you want that pops in the framework to make it do what you want to do. But yeah, this piece of work, that bring all of those different ideas together into that, and kind of comparing and bringing the what you've done, I think is just such a critical piece of work, just globally. It's awesome that the effort that was required, and that you had the wherewithal to actually do it and stick with it and go through it, is amazing. So hopefully this kind of work, like getting it out and being able to share it with as many people as possible, is kind of that ongoing step, isn't it? How do you get people to find out about these things?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, one of the things that emerged.
Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry, you go, Nick. Yeah.
No, you go ahead.
Oh no, I was I was just wondering if anybody else has any other follow-up question, but yeah, you go, Nick. Respond to Claire.
But one thing I was going to say is that, I mean, unexpected support for this has actually come from some of the earlier people involved in developing and thinking about effectiveness. I think particularly Mark Hawkins. I mean, Mark, if you go back and read that original PAME framework that he developed way back when, it's entirely consistent with what we're talking about. And he had a lot of these ideas of adaptive management in there, and how we use these things. And so I actually think Mark's actually been really supportive, but it's all really interesting of how I think what we're really talking about here is not changing the principle of what was outlined there. It's just giving us the tools to do it in a little bit more practical way. And I think that to me is the really interesting about marrying the conservation standards with this world, is that it's providing the practicality from the conservation standards world to enable the vision that was sort of set out and laid out in that work. And certainly, if you look at what Mark and others have done with the Green List, they made major strides towards this direction of adaptive management, and it's been really interesting in that regard. Okay, Beth.
Yeah, and this is very practical, so this may not you may not have gotten here, but because you've tested this out quite a bit, I'm just wondering, is there a minimum set of indicators to kind of reduce overall monitoring burden, but a minimum set of indicators that would still allow you to do the benefits of showing progress and getting the most out of adaptive management, but reduce the workload? Have you considered that, and have you found anything like that?
That's a really good question, and I'm going to come back to. I was going to come back to here real quick, which is this. Sorry, I'm on one screen here, so I don't have two screens. It's a little tricky. But if you come back and at some point look in detail at this slide that I shared here, which is the sort of the full list, right? This thing here, which is kind of showing the full list. One of the things is I would challenge each of us to sort of say, well, what would you remove, or what would be lower priority here? And it's pretty interesting. I think one of our biggest insights, and one of the things I think is most useful about the thinking our group was done, is this color coding of them into enabling conditions, adaptive management processes, intermediate results, and then ultimate outcomes. And if you're familiar with the MET, it's not that different than the MET, which kind of coded things as inputs, outputs, whatever those other categories were. It's sort of similar types of thinking. But one of our big ahas is that for management purposes, you can't roll them all up equally. It's adding apples and oranges. That if you're adding a score of how did you do in terms of accessibility of decisions, and you try to compare that with did you do a situation analysis, and you can try to compare that, did you get your immediate result on your objective? It doesn't make even sense to add them up. And so so one of the things that we're trying to avoid is score-based systems where everything gets a 1, 2, 3, and then your average score is a 2.6. It doesn't mean anything. So we're actually really resisting trying to roll things up. And that's why when I showed you that example of like the dashboard that we're trying to create here, to me, it's much more important to show the detail. This is a little busy. I think there's a lot we could do with user interface to make this a little less scary and a little less busy. But I think there's a lot we could do here of showing people where their challenges are. But if I was a manager, I would kind of ignore the greens. I'm really interested in the reds. It's right. The reds are where, and if I'm working with a thing that truly reports the red, I'm not going to come and punish them. I'm going to come give them additional resources to fix the damn red, right? I mean that's what we should actually be in the mode of. But what that sort of also taught me in answer to your question is it's really hard to get rid of any of these because they're all important, but they're just sort of important for different things. But one of my favorite quotes is, it's better to have approximate answers to exact questions than to have exact answers to things that don't matter. And so I would almost rather have a qualitative understanding, but honest understanding of where these holes are, even if it's a quick and dirty assessment, than to spend a lot of time getting a really precise answer to any one of these questions. And I think that's the purpose of these kinds of effectiveness assessment tools. So I would love to hear what you think we could maybe minimize. I think you'll find, like me, it's hard because they actually are the core of what we need to do. But also, what level of detail do we need to answer them to make it useful? Does that make any sense, Beth?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think your point on how much detail do we need to provide, I think that might be the key response, that it's not about taking anything away, but how much detail do you need to go into really to answer it, to identify what the problem is, or that it's fine. Yeah.
But that's also where I'm really proud of, I think, these questions with nuance, these yes/no answer with questions with nuance, because it has a lot more richness than a 1 to 4 score, and especially if you don't roll them up, or if you're really using them to then point people where they have holes, or one of the things that we've done here. I'll show you an example here of from the frame. So this is the framework itself. This is what the actual. Well, no, that's blacked out. Let's see if I can. But this is what the framework would actually look like itself. But if you look at the questions that we have here for design and context, okay, have values for the site, have focal values for the site been identified? All right. The answer is yes, and this is in honor of John Morrison, represented the overall biodiversity of the site. So this idea of drawing from the conservation standards the best is you want your values to be representative. That's the dark green. And again, this also comes to the conservation standards, this idea that, yeah, very good and good. You want to allow people to be good, even if they're not very good, they can always improve. So it's fine if they're statutory or non-systematically selected. If the answer is no, then we could say, but you could retroactively identify them. Okay, that's not ideal, but at least you're doing the right thinking. You're setting out on the path of where you need to go. And then if no, not yet, all right, well, let's send you to guidance. And this is where we're hoping to build various forms of guidance that would actually walk people of how to do this work. So you might actually see things like, an example of it, but we would actually create guidance decks like this, which of course is stolen straight from the conservation standards and FOS's work. But here, how do you define natural value? So if they answer no, I'd love to send them to a deck like this or a YouTube video that walks them through that process of how you identify your values, or better yet, send them to a conservation coach who can help them do this thing. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to a simple question.
Oh, I thought it was a very good question and an equally very good answer too. Thank you so much, Nick, for all of that, and thank you again, everybody, for participating and for your questions. I think we are right at the end of our session, so I will need to close this. But please, share this. Go and have a look at the resource. I will just send this link here now, where you can go and have a look at where our website, and we'll update all the information, all the resources, and including today's recording up there as well. Go and have a look at the resources. Go and have a look at the paper and at the framework that Nick has and colleagues have developed. And share this widely. And keep talking. Reach out if you have questions. I would agree with Nick on that. And before we go away, I'll just close with a karakia as well. So unuhia ki te uru tapunui, kia wātia, kia mama, te ngako, te tinana, te wairoa i te ara tākata, ki koia rā e rongo, whakaira ake ki runga, kia tina, huie, taikie. Thank you everyone very much, and have a good afternoon. Kia ora.